An idea I've brought up on the show before, most recently in episode 59 about drug cartels, is the idea that the United States of America is an empire. Thinking of America as an empire isn't a concept that we talk about in our time, but is one that if we were gazing back through the lens of history, we undoubtedly would. The U.S. was undeniably founded with inspiration from the Roman Republic and with intentional attempts to construct it in such a way that it would guard against becoming an empire. At least an empire in the contemporary to the founding sense, holding large swaths of land under subjugation without a means of representation into the governing order. Paradoxically, though, even the founding fathers, particularly Thomas Jefferson, talked about a, quote, empire of liberty, which, in its essence, outside of the continent of North America, looks a lot like the Empire of America as it currently stands. Nowadays, with manifest destiny complete and the country spanning from sea to shining sea, America is a continental empire. But in practice, the empire is its navy, military, and increasingly obvious economy that underpin the financial system and global trade network. The U.S. is a global commercial empire, one that's become more blatant during the Bush era, when bilateral trade agreements were used as leverage, punishing countries that didn't support the war on terror, Iraq, and other agendas. Though the ball was already tipping and rolling that way prior. Since we don't talk about it very much, we don't pause to acknowledge it or ask, what are we going to do with this empire? Most of the time, we are so wrapped up in various pressing issues that we don't take a moment to reflect on the implications of being an empire and what we want to achieve with it, or even what's happening with it. The geographic and resource advantages of the United States, along with its isolation, allow the country to stumble along, making mistakes and eventually correcting course, often without facing major consequences. This has defied much of the United States' 250 years, punctuated by individuals or movements that took it upon themselves to put the country back on an improved track. Today, I would reckon, it's more important than ever to talk about, because the issues of empire are becoming increasingly blatant, obvious, and demanding attention. How are we going to take care of the people within it? How can we truly reform it? And how will we engage outwardly with the rest of the world? And something I never thought of, other than maybe giving Puerto Rico statehood, do we want to expand into more territory? The complexities of the planet, driven by technological advancements and the unpredictable global weather system, are only going to intensify the issues the country faces, and how we plan to solve them. One idea I've thought about for a long time is, if we have an empire, do we also have an emperor? Do we have an imperial president? If we trace things back, I think you can make an argument that there's been times when a president has acted in an imperial manner. If it's Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, Andrew Jackson with the Trail of Tears, or as it's argued in a 1973 book titled The Imperial Presidency, tracing a direct line from FDR that I could say can be drawn straight through to today. That being an increase in the expansion of presidential powers, particularly in the ability to conduct war operations, covert or secret edicts, trade between countries, and the use of executive orders. That line over the past 20 years has shot up, and we're now riding the exponent. As my guest in this episode relays, there's been a series of structural issues within our Constitution that have been exploited to an ever-expanding degree by the executive branch. This shows up in everything from more lawyers in a room to justify taking an executive action, to an increased unilateral presidential power, especially in times of a crisis. This is only exacerbated by the lack of attention given to the structural reform, Congress largely ignoring it, and deferral by all of the courts. In practice, this equates to an abandonment of the rules of checks and balances first envisioned as the structure to the government. Though things aren't all doom and gloom, to be able to improve any problem, we first need to be aware of it. We are currently living through an era of increased presidential powers that are under our nose, growing and growing. The way out? Well, my guest, who's worked for numerous presidential administrations and has literally wrote the book on how to improve this, has many ideas. In this interview, he provides both a behind-the-scenes look at how this imperial presidency plays out through the halls of the West Wing, the interplay of the courts, Congress, and the space between, not to mention how presidents expand their power. A movement towards centralization of decision-making is a gravity that is bound to happen within any system of people, from a government to a company to a team of people trying to build a bridge. Being aware of that, though, along with the issues and lessons of history, as to why making this single person responsible for the fate of any aim are numerous enough that we should heed those lessons and create an open dialogue on what we can do better. Because the next 4 years, along with the next 50 years, will be littered with unchecked imperial decisions if we don't. Regardless of the party, the structure of our executive needs reform. My guest for this episode is Yale law professor and author of the National Security Constitution, as well as the updated National Security Constitution in the 21st Century, Professor Harold Koh. Thank you, Harold, for joining. Thank you for listening. And wherever this finds you on our big, blue, beautiful planet, I'm wishing you well. All right, I gotta do that cliche thing before the episode starts. If you like what you're hearing, please follow the show on whatever platform you're hearing it through. And if you would, give us a rating as well, as both of those help keep the show going and get it found. One last thing, if you want to submit a topic for me to cover, throw me a person you want me to interview or talk with, even if you want to talk with me, or you just want to tell me how terrible of a job I did on something, check out bandwidth.productions to visit the site and drop us a note. All right, well, thank you again. Appreciate your time. Would you introduce us?
I'm Harold Hungju Koh from Yale Law School.
Well, thank you again. To get us started, I always like to ask people the first time they come on is, what do you like to do that makes you happy?
I root for the Boston Red Sox. That doesn't always make me happy. I love Broadway musicals, and we just did a show last night called "She Loves Me" by the guys who made Fiddler on the Roof. And while I was sitting there, I realized it was actually the basis of the same story as "You've Got Mail," which is one of my favorite movies. So it was a great night.
So it's like a You Got Mail musical?
Yeah, except it's done with snail mail.
Right.
In Hungary in the 1950s.
That's a nice twist to it.
Yeah.
That was a great movie when it came out. I remember that. There is a certain style of like 90s, early 2000s cinema that I don't think has ever been replicated, that it made for a lot of fun movies that I don't know if they would get made today.
You know where it's going, but you love where it ends up.
Exactly. Yeah. I also know what it's like to root for a team that's not that great. I'm from Chicago, and the Cubs have been my team throughout my whole life. So most of it has been famine, not so much feasting. So,
well, did it for both of us.
Yeah. All right. Well, I was introduced to your work through that Salon article that I reached out to you after seeing you quoted in there. And the concept of an imperial president has actually been something that I've been looking into since college, essentially, when I was introduced to this through some of the international relations classes I was taking. And it's something that I don't know if I would say I enjoyed reading about, because it's kind of a tumultuous idea. But I was very intrigued by your work, especially the National Security Constitution and the book that you've written, and some of your comments in that Salon article. So first thing I want to ask you to kind of set us up and set the stage here is, when it comes to presidential authority and a means of acting with that authority, do you think we live in a time where we can categorize it as an imperial president?
Increasingly so. And at the dawn of the Trump administration, and we're here speaking about a month before he takes office, I think it's an incredible danger. There's a great irony here. I was a lawyer in the executive branch for 4 times in my career. Each time the thought of the lawyers is to try to protect our national security by giving the president as much freedom of movement as possible. But when you put together thousands of decisions like that, it ends up creating a president who's remarkably unconstrained by checks and balances.
Hmm.
And you have the Supreme Court weighing in now by saying he's also free because of various forms of immunity. And so now we have a president who's really a person of dubious character who has almost no constraints on him coming in. And, that's one reason why I think everybody's trembling.
Interesting. When it comes to especially a crisis, so I think this is a direct quote from you that I pulled. So presidents have institutional incentives to monopolize the response, and Congress has incentives to acquiesce, and the courts have incentives to defer. Now, how does that end up shaking out in action and abuse by presidents? So, there's this norm and this state that seems like we're increasingly becoming, a quote unquote imperial presidency. But when it comes to crises, and especially seeing that this type of action by presidents seems to be bipartisan, even though, certain parties seem to abuse it more. The abuse of these, powers and institutional incentives previously were just norms, similar to the norm of FDR, before FDR broke it, of only running twice for presidents before finally that was codified into law. So how do these institutional incentives to monopolize the response and Congress's incentives to acquiesce and the courts to defer, how does that end up shaking out in action by presidents?
Yeah, so let me give a historical answer from my own life. It's a relationship between constitutions and institutions. Constitutions lay out a scheme of power sharing, which, in high school civics you learn is checks and balances. But in fact, the way it plays out in history is because of crisis, and institutions respond to crisis. And what often happens in those circumstances is that certain institutions will respond to those crises by acting, others will respond by deferring. And the quote that you read is an important one, there, because um, the theory I've been pushing is not one of personality, it's one of structure. And it's that over time, at the beginning of the Republic, uh, the framers thought that Congress should have most of the foreign policy, national security power. But as an institution, it was just structurally incapable of handling that power. And so the power shifted to the president. And then the president, particularly George Washington, both used the power but also showed self restraint. For example, he left office after 2 terms. But as time has gone on and the world has become more dangerous, power keeps flowing to the president. And the way that it happens is a crisis arises, the president feels an imperative to act. Congress would like to avoid responsibility because, if you vote for the wrong thing, you can be voted out of office. And then when it gets to the courts, they either approve the president's power or they decline to rule, leaving his actions in place. And the result of this interaction, this synergistic dysfunction, is that the president keeps acquiring more and more unilateral power. Um, I think it's important to tell the story in a way that doesn't present all presidents as evil. Some presidents seize power, like George W. Bush and Trump. Some presidents use the power unilaterally, but in a reactive fashion, like Obama and Biden. But whatever happens, with each successive administration, the power keeps moving more and more toward the president. And so, and then the president acquires resources to allow him to exercise that power, and it becomes increasingly concentrated. Just to give a subtle example, but one that probably people don't know about, I was in the Biden administration at the first days in 2021, January 2021, which was in the middle of the pandemic. And it turned out that most of the people couldn't report to work. And so we were sworn in remotely and told to come in, 1 or 2 days a week. And they had a rule in the agencies, the State Department where I was working, where only 25% of the staff were allowed there at any one time. But at the White House, they had constant COVID testing, and they were at full strength. So during that period, which was the first 10 months, all power flowed to the White House. And the agencies were vastly reduced in their importance because all decisions are being made by the people who are all working together in this small space. Now, I don't think that was anybody's fault. It wasn't evil, but it just continued this trend. And so I think the main point is that the historical pattern, which I point to in my book, is over and over and over. The president has this incentive to monopolize. Congress has an incentive to acquiesce, and the courts have an incentive to rubber stamp. And the net result of that is that all three branches push power to the president. And then you suddenly have a situation where you have a president who relishes this power and wants to use it in particular ways, and there's no real check on his power. And so the high school idea of checks and balances stops at the water's edge, which is completely contrary to what the Constitution demands. If anything, the whole point of a Constitution was that we not have a king. And the ironic situation is we're very close to the situation now, which is exactly what the Constitution was meant to avoid.
Well, that's sobering. Synergistic dysfunction. I really like that. That's a really well put way of framing this. And I had no idea about the power flowing to the White House like that during the early days of COVID. I mean, it makes sense if they're the only ones that are there frequently and whatnot. But I think, what's that truism? Like you give away the power and it's hard to take it back. And if that flows to the White House, that becomes systemic. And then what systems are the hardest things to change. So that's going to be difficult to take it away once everyone comes back to the office. Not to mention, I mean, Rex Tillerson did a really great job at the State Department of gutting it.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point, is that executives want people who are answerable to them. For example, Trump's major concern right now is personal loyalty. So, he's appointed Marco Rubio to be Secretary of State. I'm sure he will be confirmed. But in fact, there are multiple secretaries of state coming up. Elon Musk is a de facto Secretary of State. Jared Kushner is off doing his own thing. So why would these people deal with the U.S. government through official channels when they can deal with them through these unofficial channels? And the net result is it's about access of power to the president. Whoever can get to Trump is the one who has the influence. And that makes it extremely personal as opposed to one where the institutions are what counts. And then finally, you have the situation where, the major check on the president within the executive branch is the bureaucracy. And now they propose things like Schedule F, which will get rid of many career people, precisely because those people, the deep state, as he called it, resisted presidential initiatives in his first term.
Yeah, it's almost like the stage has been set for somebody to come in and act this way. I also appreciate the way you said there's multiple secretaries of state, because you think of like Thomas Jefferson being the first Secretary of State is quite different than the way that things are acting now. Because I mean, Jared Kushner totally did act like a Secretary of State. I never thought of it that way, but in his dealings with Saudi Arabia, for example, I mean, he was clearly making deals and acting in that type of fashion.
Yeah, just take this, JR, across from the White House, there's the old post office building, which became the
OBOB? Was it old executive office building?
The Trump International Hotel.
Oh, that's what you mean. Okay, yes.
Then they sold it to the Waldorf, and they've just bought it. Trump is saying he wants to buy it back. If you were the Saudis and you wanted to deal with the United States, would you go to the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh and deal with the ambassador and then go through Marco Rubio? Or would you just fly in, get your suite at the Trump Hotel, sit in the bar and talk to Jared Kushner? You know, which is faster? Which is more likely to get you the answer that you want? And the latter approach is totally opaque. It's not subject to congressional oversight. And as a result, you have the kind of deal making that you have when you're dealing with members of the court of a king.
Yeah, it does. You're right. It does look a lot like a court of a king. That's a pithy way of putting it. Yeah, The Economist said that recently. I thought they really put it well, that Trump's policy tends to operate most by whoever talked to him last. So that type of proximity, at least to the upcoming president, is certainly going to be beneficial if you're able to get into that circle or that court, as you put it. Now,
Yeah.
kind of moving back a little bit, how has the slide of power moved towards the executive in recent decades? So, setting the stage for where we're at now, and that there's essentially not many norms to break anymore. I'm sure it started around 9/11, but was it already on this type of systemic dysfunction and consolidation of power in the decades prior to 9/11?
Yeah, so I first wrote a book called The National Security Constitution, Sharing Power After the Iran-Contra Affair that came out in 1989. It was a book on which I got tenure at Yale Law School. I was very excited about it. And when I turned it in to the publisher, Yale Press, I thought, I should have written this book such a way that it could be updated to the present. And 30 plus years have gone by. Since then, I served in 4 different presidential administrations, and I thought, I've been watching this development with my own eyes. Maybe I ought to update it for the 21st century. And what I would say is I left the government in the Clinton administration on January 2001. And at the time, George W. Bush had just barely been elected by a decision of the Supreme Court, was the final straw. And he was proceeding very cautiously. And then 9/11 occurred. And then suddenly there was huge deference to Bush. Now, if you think about it, he could have exercised that power in a more restrained way. He could have decided, I'm not going to invade Iraq. I'm not going to open black sites. I'm not going to open Guantanamo. I'm not going to use torture or other kinds of means. But instead, he did all these things in the name of self-defense. What's remarkable is that Congress just couldn't have been more supine or more willing to support this. When I came back into the government in the Obama administration, I was shocked by how much power the executive branch had acquired. And then I left in 2014. And when I came back in 2021 in the Biden administration, it was as if one muscle had been given steroids for 20 years. The military and defense and intelligence arm was just wildly out of proportion. So I would attend meetings, JR, that I used to attend as a lawyer. There would be one lawyer from Justice, one lawyer from the State Department, one lawyer from Defense, one lawyer from the CIA. By 2021, there'd be one lawyer from Justice, one lawyer from State, 5 lawyers from Intelligence, and 10 lawyers from the Defense Department, and things are being decided by a majority vote. And so obviously those people who are favoring diplomatic solutions would be outvoted. And those people who are favoring the use of force would, be listened to. And this was combined with the fact that, Congress doesn't vote for treaties anymore. And so it became much easier for the president to bomb than to make a treaty, which is a very curious outcome in the 21st century. So I think our constitutional law is becoming increasingly misshapen. Now, the book was called The National Security Constitution because within our constitutional structure, and I've been teaching constitutional law for 40 years, there's a subset of the Constitution that controls how foreign policy decisions are made. And what I noticed was that there were two competing visions, which can be summarized by two different case names. One is a vision of shared power that was expressed in a case called the steel seizure case, the famous case about Harry Truman trying to seize the steel mills and he was stopped. But the other is a case called U.S. Curtis versus Curtis Wright Export Corporation, which says the president has the sole power. It's a vision of unilateral power, imperial power. And when I was in the government in the 80s, this used to be called by government lawyers the Curtis Wright, so I'm right site. In other words, if we wanted to do something that wasn't clear could be done, you just cite Curtis Wright, saying the president has the sole power. And it occurred to me that these two visions, executive power or Curtis Wright and shared power or steel seizure, are very dramatically different visions of what the national security constitution should be. They've been at war since the beginning of the republic, but I think it's fair to say that in the 21st century, particularly after 9/11, the executive power Curtis Wright vision has seized dominance. And it's that vision that's driving where we are. Now, the Democrats, when they come in, tend to try to pull back, but they undercorrect because usually they don't have legislative majorities. And so for the president to do something, they just have to respond unilaterally. So, Biden didn't have a vote to spare. And I think if Harris had been elected, she would have been much more attuned to Congress's concerns, but still the same problem would have continued. So that's why it's really a problem of structure and not personalities.
Yeah, it seems systemic in that there's a gravity towards it, and once you start making these type of decisions, it's all too easy to go back. Like what you said, that's the Democrats have seemingly tried, but they've undercorrected because they're fighting the system that's maintaining this in place, and then also it's just so much faster, I'm assuming, to operate via executive fiat than it would be to try to do something slower, and getting elected is harder and harder.
Well, there's a mindset that says, and I was dean of a law school, so I was an executive myself, and I noticed this. When you're an executive, you talk to people who say what you want them to say. They tend to defer to you. They don't want to get you mad. And you feel like you're dealing with all the problems of the world. And so you don't feel like you're overreaching. You feel like you're beleaguered. And then, but you're expected to respond. And if you don't respond, you get blamed. And so it's in the executive instinct to say, if I have a choice between doing nothing or doing something, I'll do something. And that means that the burden of response, the president has both the burden of response and the capability of response. And when you put those two things together, the president has incentive to act. And then, should you include people who don't work for you and consult with them? Well, they might tell you no. So, this. But the irony, of course, is if if Congress is not in on it, then if it goes bad, they'll blame you later, and you lose support. Here's a good example. You know, Trump could lead us into world war in the Middle East. Right now is about the most dangerous situation you can imagine. We have Syria is the government just collapsed, but we don't really know who's in charge. Israel is fighting Hamas, Hezbollah, Lebanon. They've been bombing Iran. We have troops are being fired upon in the Red Sea by the Houthis. So there are all these different strands, and it could all come together into one massive conflict. And the question is Congress going to get involved and set limits to when we should go to war? Because after all, Congress has the power to declare war. But I think we all know Trump is not going to ask them. And, they're probably not going to assert the authority to do so unless they change their focus on this. And then we now have a defense secretary coming in who, is a Fox News commentator if he gets confirmed. So suddenly we're in a situation where the main thing that you were relying upon to restrain the executive branch, which is the character of the individuals in these positions, is not something you can count on anymore. And that puts our democracy in a very precarious place.
Very sobering. You know, the look behind the scenes that you were, mentioning of lawyers, it's really interesting because that's not something that I would imagine most folks would consider. Is, if there's a statute or a law and you can find a reason for it, then you can justify whatever it is that you're doing. And it's, once again, it seems like there's a bend towards, well, if I fill the room with lawyers and they give me enough statutes to be able to go off of, I can justify a ABC decision. It makes me think a lot, like the world that I'm in. It makes me think a lot of, it sounds like Janet Yellen, but like data dependent. So if you can find data for something, you can justify it. But I'm telling you, I do data analysis. You just need to find the data that tells the story you want, or craft it in such a way it's not necessarily just inherently there. There's no universal truth in the data, similar to law. There's no universal truth in it. You can always bend it in a certain way.
Yeah, they call it looking out over a crowd and picking out your friends. You find the precedents on your side and you conveniently don't mention the ones that are against you. And then if people go for it, then it's the ones that you pick that are more important going forward.
Yeah, and if no one's challenging you on it, then you can just keep doing that.
Yes, and that's where the courts come in, because if the courts refuse to hear these cases and rule on them, then what's if you can change the facts on the ground, that becomes the new status quo.
Yeah, and the status quo is increasingly what moves anything, since Congress doesn't really get much done unless it's a massive bill that happens once every 3 or 4 years, and can't undo it. Like Trump's was a Tax Cut and Jobs Act that he did, which is going to increase people's income taxes pretty soon. I highly doubt that they're going to be able to get anything like that through again.
Well, there's another angle which is equally important and fits with the picture we're discussing, which is the president's power to declare an emergency. So a good example was the wall, the border wall. We all remember Trump said he's going to build a wall, Mexico's going to pay for it. Of course, Mexico didn't pay for it. And they start building the wall anyway. And Congress set a limit to how much you could spend and then stopped. And then Trump declared a national emergency so he can get additional funding. It turned out the emergency was that Congress was refusing to appropriate the money that he requested. That's ordinary governmental process. And as a result, he got sued, but the litigation terminated before he left office, or terminated when he left office. So the status quo was that money was being used to build this wall, and then Biden continued to build the wall. The inertia was just very powerful. So now we've got a partial wall, and Trump's coming back in, so he's going to pick it up again. And here, why should the national emergency be Congress exercising its legitimate power of the purse? That's not an emergency. That should be good government.
It's smart. How the operation of this is smart. Being able to declare a national emergency to get what you want, anyways. It's nefarious. It's clearly subverting what I would say, like, the ethics and the intent of the Constitution. But it is a smart actor to go in there and to do that. Not to mention, from Iran Contra through now, of setting the stage for this increased centralization of authority.
Yeah, look at the kind of sense to our allies. So take Canada. Why did Justin Trudeau go down to Mar-a-Lago to beg Trump not to impose tariffs? Because last time Trump imposed tariffs on Canada as kind of a whipping boy, he declared a national emergency, and Trudeau called Trump. This is all documented, and said, "Why are you imposing emergency?" And Trump said, "Because Canada is a national security threat." And Trudeau said, "We're your closest ally. How can we be a national security threat?" And Trump said, "Well, in the war on 1812, you burned the White House."
Oh my God.
Of course, Trump responded, "We didn't burn the White House. The Brits burned the White House." Trump didn't even know. So what it means is that you have people who are ignorant of history making these kinds of decisions and abusing this power. And This is the kind you see all the time on Game of Thrones or things like this. Gladiator, the unwise king who thinks they know everything, and then everybody just lean over to him. I just saw the movie Gladiator 2. I don't know if you've seen it, but at one point, the new crazy Caesar declares a monkey as his first consul. And then the real guy, the real, Rasputin in the picture is Denzel Washington, who's declared to be the second consul. But the thing that really strikes you is that he says this is going to be my companion, will be my first consul, this monkey, and everybody just nods. they're such cowards, It's they don't stand up for what they ought to be fighting for, and that's the amazing thing about Congress. Congress should assert itself, and it hasn't done so. And so Trump has decided to test them by putting forward all these extreme nominees, and then this sort of blitz process means that some of them will get through. And I'm sure you've heard about the Overton window. How you move the public perception, something that was previously unthinkable becomes acceptable. So, it used to be that we have as a standard, let's have a good attorney general who's qualified. And now the standard is, are they better than Matt Gaetz? And that's a crazy perspective on the world. Or you have Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Pete Hegseth. And the working assumption now is that one, two, or maybe all three will get through, even though none of them, in my view, are qualified minimally. And but when you blitz like that, somebody's going to get through the protection.
Yeah, it's a probably working strategy. What you're describing, it does really sound like the court of a king. And I mean, honestly, if you were to read this on a piece of paper, it could possibly make a great Shakespearean comedy. But when you see its real life, it's funny how if something isn't a play or a show or a movie, you can be amused by it, like the monkey being declared consul. And I think there's even stories of, I think it was Nero, Caligula naming their horse as their consul. So I mean, it's happened. But and you're in these
naming every one of your in-laws to be an ambassador, and then naming your daughter to be senator from Florida. We're not too far off that right now, I'm sad to say.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Yeah, because Rubio would be leaving. Yeah, it's an interesting picture of what has been slipped towards this. And what I want to ask you is, why has there been this bend towards the executive? Is it a result of the framework of the Constitution, or the way that government has been scaled up over time, that it creates a certain gravity to move towards this type of executive action in the first place?
Well, the book, The National Security Constitution, first century, I thought it was good not to just be presentist, but to go back to the beginning of the Republic and explain how this happened. How did we get into this situation? And I run through 7 years of American history. The founding, the framers thought that Congress should be responsible, and then over time, George Washington essentially assumed the power. Then, the second period, when up through Teddy Roosevelt, America becomes a regional power and uses presidential power to assert control over the Western Hemisphere. And then up through World War II and Franklin Roosevelt's 4 terms, where, in responding to the Depression in the First World War, he just very dramatically assumes power and creates a national security state. And then the Cold War, where, we're facing the threat of extinction by nuclear weapons. And so suddenly the imperative becomes having the president or somebody be able to respond instantaneously. And then I would say, though, that the shared power vision carried the day into the 21st century. But it's the presidencies since then, George W. Bush and Trump, very dramatic, proactive assertions of presidential power, and then Obama and Biden under correction. In Biden's case, he only had 4 years. Um, Obama, I think, wanted to look ahead. And as a result, we have a situation where it's not a pendulum swing one way and a pendulum swing back. The pendulum is always moving toward the unilateral direction. That's how we got here. And, JR, when I first wrote the book, I was, a very young professor. And I thought, since then I've served in the government for 4 different presidents in 5 decades. That probably won't happen that much. And maybe I ought to write a book about this because I owe it to students who are saying, how did it get like this? To explain how we got here and what we ought to do about it.
I certainly would read that. I think that would be very interesting to see how we got to this place. Because I mean, it's interesting how once a structural institution, especially governments, get set up in such a way, how it tends to gravitate towards, before there's a correction, towards action and decisiveness. But how this is played up in the U.S., I think, is most interesting because we still mostly talk about it being a republic, and we have the will of the people and whatnot. But in reality of the actual structural institutions, it's not at all that case. Increasingly so, and to your point, it's bipartisan in a way, right? I mean, Obama took a lot of executive actions, especially like the ones he always gets tagged for, is drone strikes and those type of things. But it wasn't a correction in the way that was assumed he might have been making. And by doing that, it set up the next person to be able to come in and push it further and further and further. And I think what you're saying with the pendulum, it's stark, but it's necessary to know. And I think a lot of times to understand the history makes the context of what you're living through a little bit clearer, at least.
Yeah, very, very often in the government, JR, they set it up so that you can't reverse a policy unless everybody agrees. So that means everybody has a veto. All agencies have a veto. So, situations like closing Guantanamo or getting people off Guantanamo, if there's one agency that thinks somebody's still dangerous and wants to keep them on, they vote against, and then the person stays there. And, so Obama came in 2009, and he said, I'm going to close Guantanamo in a year. And then Biden said the same thing. It's still open, and there's still about 30 people there. And, I don't know who we're protecting from what. These guys are in their 60s. They're very sick, most of them. They don't have any actionable intelligence at this point. And the Al-Qaeda units they belong to don't exist. Nevertheless, we're holding them. And then even the military commissions they set up suggested that the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed V be released. And then the Secretary of Defense overruled it. Now, Biden could have overruled him, but he didn't. And so Guantanamo remains open, and I don't think Trump's going to close Guantanamo. So we have this absurd situation that something that was supposed to be closed by 2010 will be open going into 2025, and it hurts us everywhere. After all, if we have an offshore prison where people have no rights, why shouldn't the Russians have their own one where the Navalny's of the world are held, or the Chinese have their ones, which the Uyghurs are held? So, it really diminishes us abroad.
Oh, most certainly. No, I could not agree more. I mean, even the means of labeling under, the Bush administration of terrorists or don't have to be subject to U.S. law, and then a category all unto themselves, which I'm sure you understand far more than I do. That just seems appalling to me. I mean, you're supposed to be, you want to be held to a higher standard, but what we're increasingly doing is, it sounds propagandistic. We're saying one thing and we're actually doing quite different. And what we talk about internally versus our actions externally are continuously being diametric. And unfortunately, some of that national security over the apparatus is now being turned internally as well, which obviously concerns me.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if terrorism is considered the number one threat, then people don't look to things like climate change or um, uh, pandemics. So at a time when COVID, when thousands of people are dying a day, many more than have died in any terrorist attacks, the executive branch of the United States is way tilted toward stopping these threats, and everything is viewed as a threat. And so you have also Homeland Security. Uh, you know, after 9/11, George W. Bush just merged a whole bunch of agencies that previously existed into something called the Department of Homeland Security. It was like 50 different units. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Immigration Service, um, Customs and Border Protection. But it's a amazingly disjointed and fragmented agency with not enough resources. And they're responsible for everything, including FEMA, the emergency management, and someone ought to take the agency and streamline it and figure out what exactly they're supposed to do. But nobody has the incentive to do that. And now we have this Department of Government Efficiency, which is nominally headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Ramaswamy.
And you know, um, I don't think anybody seriously believes that they're going to actually make a change. Although they'll make all kinds of recommendations, and God knows where that's going to leave us.
Yeah, I'm worried about that. I'm worried about the changes that they may make by somehow just being the last person in the room talking to the incoming president to bring that back. What are some of the unilateral presidential and executive powers that concern you, and where is the imbalance growing the most insofar as foreign affairs and national security policy?
I'd identify two in particular. One is the president's power to break treaties unilaterally. Trump is a isolate. MAGA, America First, meaning America alone. His view is that he can just exit a treaty or any international agreement um, by a tweet. So just imagine this. If on January 20th he sends a tweet out saying, "I hereby withdraw the United States from NATO, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization," um, many would argue that that's legal. And that's a frightening power because it took, decades for these relationships to be created. And it's also clear that the United States alone, even though it's the leading power in the world, cannot solve these global problems by itself. The other great concern is that the president can, using force more and more remotely, launch an attack pretty much whenever he wants. And Congress is not going to stop it as long as it's over fast. Um, Increasingly, this can be done even without troops. It can be done with drones, artificial intelligence, and cyber commands. And that puts and special forces. That puts the president in the power of being able to, be a global executioner. And there's very little to check that power. He has to send in a report, but the reports are usually sent and very formulaic. And Congress won't stand up to him. I think the person we want to remember at this particular moment is Mitch McConnell. Um, Mitch McConnell, when the second impeachment was done, the January 6th impeachment, all he had to do was urge Republican senators to vote for Trump's impeachment. They were 10 votes short. 7 Republican senators did vote for impeachment, even without McConnell's support. Anyway, McConnell voted against. So did a bunch of other people. Trump was not impeached. And had he been impeached, he couldn't serve as president again. And then when McConnell stepped back and stopped being minority leader, even though he obviously dislikes or maybe even hates Trump, he just said, "I support Trump." And now he's a person who has polio. Had polio, so did I. I had polio, and Robert F. Kennedy's uh, aide is talking about eliminating the polio vaccine. I mean, this is to me just a gut punch. How can we go back and subject another generation of children to what Mitch McConnell and I went through? But I noticed that McConnell finally got it in himself to say something about it, but he didn't mention Robert F. Kennedy by name. Why did he just say, "I'm going to vote against Robert F. Kennedy Jr."? He's not qualified. He's not. You know, you can put somebody in an unimportant position, but Health and Human Services is not one of them.
Right. Um, yeah, the military, being able to do just direct military action, um, is definitely frightening, especially because the increase of precision and drone warfare is making it a lot quicker to do something like that. This kind of reminds me of the Supreme Court with the Trail of Tears saying, you can't relocate these indigenous peoples, and Andrew Jackson essentially saying, you and what army is going to stop me? It seems like we're reliving some of that history. What are some?
Well,
Oh, go ahead.
everybody understands that the only way out of this mess is for some kind of binding peace arrangement that all of the parties endorse, and that would create a stable um, equilibrium going forward. That's not going to be provided by retaliatory military strikes. But if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Oh, most certainly, yeah, and especially when that hammer is so effective. I mean, it's part of the systemic issues that I'm keep thinking as you're espousing on this is, well, they want to keep doing it. If it's one, if they're getting away with it, and two, if it works, like it works because it's decisive. And if you can make something that's decisive, it's a lot easier than trying to make some type of decision that's opaque. There's a historian that I'm acquainted with, Felipe Fernandez Armesto, and he has this idea that bad ideas travel faster than good ideas, because good ideas are complicated, they're nuanced, you usually need a lot of context, and a lot of times they're a bit illogical at first, and then once you understand that context, it makes much more sense, and you're able to see it as a good idea. Where bad ideas are distillations, they're simple, they're easy to understand, they're usually playing on some type of trope or stereotype, which ultimately kind of brings that saying, that truism, wow, a lie can circle the world twice before the truth has a chance to leave the room. And it makes me think of this, where it's a lot more effective to be decisive and take action and continue to consolidate power, because then it's done, it's over with, you can move on to the next thing. But the slipping and doing that is actually, it makes everything more unsafe and more turbulent and less predictable. Now I'm thinking of the Benjamin Franklin quote of, those who sacrifice liberty for security deserve to have nor liberty nor security. So now we kind of have this picture of increasing consolidation of authority towards the executive branch, something that's been happening, you highlighted since Iran-Contra, which the details of that story sound so conspiratorial. Anyone I've ever laid that out to, they're like, "This, no way this could be true." I'm like, "No, it's true. You should go read it." But regardless, so you detail from Iran-Contra through today, and obviously I think people understand the exponent wave of 9/11 now. But what would some structural updates to the system that you'd suggest to improve this?
Yeah, I mean, the last part of the book, the last 3 chapters, is all about institutional reforms. First of all, we have to, before any of those can go into effect, we have to recognize we have a problem. So, you know, it's like Apollo 13. Houston, we have a problem. If we, they tell the joke, how many psychiatrists does it take to change the light bulb? The light bulb must want to change. If we, the Democrats think the problem is Trump, and the Republicans think the president doesn't have enough power, we're never going to solve the problem, because nobody has an incentive to fix the structure. But that was another part of my thinking about the redoing it for the 21st century. I thought it was important to lay out a bunch of very achievable reforms that could happen over time. Any one of them would be helpful, but in toto, they would make a big difference. So, just to summarize, the president, I think, needs to have more checks and balances within the executive branch. He needs to have a better structure of legal advice, and he needs to have more constraints on how he does certain things, corruption, on how he does nuclear strikes, and the deep state, the whistleblowers, and the bureaucracy make a huge difference. For example, everybody who works in the U.S. government has to file a elaborate reporting requirement about any gift they take. I once had to file paperwork for something that was worth $20. It took me weeks. And you have now this flow of dark money that seems to be coming in without supervision. And it's the claim that the president is not subject to the rules that anybody in the U.S. government is subject to is just crazy. Secondly, in Congress, I think the problem is not that Congress doesn't have talented people. It's just that their voice is too disaggregated, and they need a centralized national security decision-making process. They have something called the Joint Committee on Taxation, where about 15 experts on tax make decisions with an expert staff, and their views are bipartisan and widely respected. I'm not sure why we don't have a Joint Committee on National Security. And then those people could go on to become executive officials, as John Kerry did, as Hillary Clinton did, as Joe Biden did, as Kamala Harris did. Second, I think Congress needs a legal advisor who can issue legal opinions. So when the executive branch issues a self-serving legal opinion, Congress can challenge it in an adversarial process that plays out in public. And third, the courts. I think the courts just are abdicating their function of checking executive overreach. And what Trump showed is that if you appoint enough judges, you can get them to buy into things. The two very dramatic examples were the Muslim ban decision, where the Roberts Court decided that it didn't matter what Trump had said about Muslims. What mattered is, could a hypothetical president who didn't have these discriminatory views do this and get and have a legal justification for it? So they deferred to a hypothetical president and ignored the president we actually had. The same thing happened with the immunity decision. There's an amazing moment in the immunity case, Trump versus United States, which is they say that the president's conversations with the attorney general are immune. What was Watergate? Watergate was the president, Richard Nixon, talking to the attorney general, John Mitchell. The conversations were the basis of the conspiracy. They were the basis of impeachment, which didn't go through because Nixon resigned. So, how can it be that this abuse of official powers is immune from examination? It's got to be subject to examination. Now, another thing that the court has done to insulate itself from external influences is to say they're not going to look at what other countries do. That this is deeply anti-historical. U.S. courts, when we were a small country, did nothing but look to foreign courts to figure out what to do. So, for example, if we're deciding whether the U.S. can leave a treaty unilaterally, why don't we look into what the Brits did with regard to Brexit? The prime minister tried to exit the country without parliamentary approval, and the Supreme Court said, no, you got to get parliamentary approval because it's so deeply woven, being part of the European Union is so deeply woven into the fabric of British society. And so they looked and they ended up approving it. But I think that that's clearly an example where we should be borrowing from other countries. And, we now have all the justices who routinely and rotely say we're not going to look to what other countries do. which is, don't borrow from other cultures. I'm Korean. I don't go to a bar mitzvah these days where they're not dancing to Gangnam Style. Do we say don't borrow K-pop in a Jewish bar mitzvah? Or, I go to a taco truck and they're serving kimchi. Do we say we don't borrow that? Obviously, Americans are borrowers. So if we can borrow cuisine and we can borrow culture, we got to be able to borrow law. So these are remarkably anti-globalist sentiments. And for what it's worth, if these guys are originalists, they should be following what we did at the beginning of the Republic. Um, you know, um, Brett Kavanaugh said at his confirmation, "I believe in the American rule of law," as if there's no rule of law elsewhere in the world. And let me just take an example, which might be a little bit of an antidote to this. My parents are from Korea. My father was in the democratic government that was overthrown by a military coup. So, a couple of weeks ago, I suddenly realized that the president has just declared martial law. And it just sounded so familiar. He declared martial law because the parliament wouldn't do what he wanted, the opposition party. And the Korean people didn't take it lying down. They got out in the streets and they demanded that there be a vote. And they sent troops in trying to block the vote. And the people were shouting at the troops, "Aren't you ashamed?" And as a result, the vote occurred and martial law was rescinded. And then they tried to impeach him. And initially, just like in the US, his party caved in, knuckled under, and was backing what he was doing. And then the Korean people said, "We're going to be out there on the street every week until you impeach this guy." And they were out for several weeks, and then they voted to impeach him. And, obviously the future there is uncertain, but the message that you get is that democracy and civil society in Korea is much more viscerally part of what the people do than it was 60 years ago when my father's government was overthrown. And my reaction to this is America has a lot to learn from this. Would we be out on the streets as fast? Would we respond as forcefully? Would we take no for an answer? Now the Koreans have a lot to teach Americans, I think.
Oh, yeah, most certainly. I could not agree with that more. For as much as the people of France also take to the streets, I'm always a little heartwarmed by not necessarily how they do it, but that they do it. If there's a governmental reform on, retirement or further nationalization of the railways, they seem to be very informed of what's going on. And I, one of the things I wrote down as you're talking that I think is the biggest issue that we have here is that I don't think people understand these issues. And I think a lot of that has to do with a complete failing of media to be able to, explain exactly what you just had put forward in any of these type of things. I think most of the time when people think about law or legal statutes, I think, well, obviously our civics education is terrible. But their eyes glaze over and it's just looking for a pundit. News has increasingly become entertainment. It hasn't become, information to have a shared dialogue of a public consciousness. And I think that's the biggest issue here, because I think if people understood quite to the extent of what's going on and what that leaves room and open for, and how much we're kind of giving up for not really getting anything in return here, I think it would be a much different place where we might be able to have people that would take to the streets. Because, it was astounding how quickly, that turned around in South Korea. It was, the vote for martial law and then the vote rescinding it. I think it was like midnight that night, or it was in the middle of the night that night. It was very quick.
6 hours. They said, "We're not going back to this. We fought hard for this democracy, and we're not a banana republic. You're not going to roll us like this." And how did you think you could get away with this? Now, the amazing thing was the president, Yoon Suk-yeol, he has persisted in his position. But, he's increasingly isolated.
Unknown caller.
And I think that's the basic message here, is that no politician owns our constitutional democracy. Every single one of us do. When I was in the government, JR, I took the oath 5 times. You take an oath. You don't take an oath to uphold to support or follow the president. You take an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States of America. So if you get an illegal order, you don't obey it. Now you might get kicked out or you might get blamed, but you know, I don't have a duty to do what my boss tells me if they want to do something illegal. If they're doing something illegal, they're not empowered to do it because their only power comes from doing what's consistent with the Constitution and laws of the United States of America. And so we're supposed to enforce the law without fear or favor. And I think that's what it turns on. And I do think that there's just a much in Korea. Every single person felt responsible for their democracy, and they said, you know, just because this guy wants to stay in office and thinks that his being in office is the most important thing, doesn't mean that we are silenced. It's our democracy too. And I think that's the message. Donald Trump doesn't control climate change. He doesn't control pandemics. He doesn't control this process. We all do. And so we have much of a stake in it. His margin of victory was very small. And as you said, many of the people voted based on misinformation. How could they not know that if they're worried about kitchen table issues, that imposing tariffs is going to lead to inflation? This isn't even economics 101. This is high school economics. I was watching a news show where a guy who was related to undocumented aliens said, I'm voting for Trump because he's going to improve the economy. And then they said, well, that means all your relatives will be deported. And he said, no, that's not going to happen. Then they explained to him what Trump's policies were, and he was just floored. All he was thinking about was whether Trump would improve what he pays at the gas pump or something like that, which again is based on a lot of different factors. So it is amazing. This misinformation that allows people to make decisions against their self-interest.
Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, just the tariffs. I mean, there's that scene in Ferris Bueller's Day Off where the economics class, and they're talking about Smith Hawley and how tariffs work. This is something that's been, like you said, it should be better known. And I like also the way that you put that no one owns the Constitution. I had in a previous episode, I had Steele Brand on, who's a Roman historian, and he explained how in ancient Rome they didn't have a written constitution because they saw it as, the etymology of constitution was the body. It was the body of the state. It was everybody together that comprised what was that Roman system of government. And that's what the intent of codifying it into law was here in the first place, which was we're codifying the democracy. It's demos, it's the rule of the people, which is the etymology of that. And what's supposed to be, we're all in this together. This is ours. This is a analogy of all of us working together. And I think we've moved past that because we're no longer thinking it in that way. And then to further the point, we don't have a means of gathering information in a way that's accessible to see what the actual movings of things are. Because you can look at it from a distance and you can see the sound bites, or you can see the way things are presented, which I think all sides of the media are subject to this. And what that ultimately leads to is a misunderstanding of what are the basic facts and what are the things that we should be most concerned with. It's more, how can I entertain you? How can I get you to pay attention to this? And less of what was the context that we're living in, which I think once again goes to, good ideas are complicated and nuanced, and bad ideas are easier to just push and purport. Which maybe that's the one of the things we need to consider is if something seems too simple, it likely is too simple. So maybe we should dive a little deeper.
Antidote to misinformation is more information. And the problem that we have today is that there's just so many things that we could listen to that we have no way of knowing what's accurate or not. But that's why podcasts like yours that dig a little bit deeper and allow people to sort of understand for themselves, I think is so important because, how many people will read my book? Maybe not that many, but But it's there. It's there, and that was really what drove me to do it this time around, because I just thought, if a young person starts asking, how did we get into this mess and how did we get out of it, they could reasonably say, what were the people doing who were participating in the system? Didn't they have any ideas? Can't they give a better explanation for how we got here, and can't they give a better prescription for how we get out of this? And I thought, that's why I called it the National Security Constitution for the 21st century, because it's good for 75 years. and my thought is people can read it and understand it and decide whether they agree or not. But, nobody could say that it wasn't put down somewhere for someone to understand. And that was my thinking in doing it.
Oh, that's great. I'm anxiously looking forward to cracking it open. Thank you again very much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been incredibly sobering, but far more illuminating, and I appreciate it. This is worthwhile to talk about.
Well, if you let me put in one more plug, my previous
please.
was called The Trump Administration in International Law. It came out from Oxford University Press in 2019. And, the publisher called me and said, we're putting it out again because it's about a resistance strategy to Trump. And, the truth of it is that Trump did not succeed in most of his efforts to, he failed. And how did he fail? It's just that this citizen activism was so strong, it was, he couldn't overcome it. And then he got voted out. Now that he's back in, the same strategy applies. And what I've noticed this time around is there's this deep depression that people feel, which, sort of one of Trump's attitudes about his opposition is self-silencing, self-exit, that immigrants will leave because they think they might be deported. People will leave the bureaucracy because they don't want to get fired. And then people will silence themselves because they don't want to get on the wrong side of him. I think we should be having the opposite attitude. But, you watch movies, obviously. I like the movie The Martian, where, Matt Damon says, you're in this hopeless situation. You're stranded. You can either just say this is the end of us, or you can just say, well, we'll solve this problem, we'll solve this problem, we'll solve this problem, and then if we solve enough problems, we get to have another president. And that's my attitude for the next 4 years. Just don't get into a funk, and just take it one at a time.
Yeah, I think it's great. One of the best antidotes to fear and anxiety is also knowledge. We tend to fear the unknown, and once you can understand more, and also what your actions could be, it makes it a lot easier. Because I do agree with you. I think both sides of the aisle, it's a lot of exhaustion at the state of where things are. But hey, thank you.
So much of our government is now theater, and
yes.
That's why television stars and reality show people who are experts on these things. But there is a difference between form and substance, and we need to understand the substance. And podcasts that force people to think about these issues, I think, are a real common good. And so, thank you for doing it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Well, I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great day.
Great. Take care. Thank you so much. Best happy holidays.
Thank you.